Hello, everyone. Nice to see you this evening. We'll give folks a minute or two to enter here. And since it's our last session, at least for the fall, I thought we should jump in relatively quickly. I'll be slightly more disciplined in opening tonight. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. It's really nice to see some of you here and appreciate all of the folks who've been tuning in to recordings or otherwise. A reminder, if this doesn't come up at the end of the session, that we're going to do a second course that pairs with this one in the spring. I think it's 5 more sessions that start sometime in March. I'm sure you'll hear about it, where we're going to expand, at least theoretically, on Buddhist ideas about the path to liberation with some really beautiful, fascinating material, primarily from what's called the Mahayana tradition, which I'm not going to speak about today, but just to say that there's more to come if you like. If you've had enough, I understand that as well. But it would certainly be fun for me to see some of you or see some of you again in March. So please know that you're welcome to tune in then. And if we get lost in discussion or debate or otherwise, why don't I just say now how much fun this has been for me to interact with you. I'll prepare some of these presentations and just get to spend some time with you all. So thank you again for your attention. You can find me. I'm a professor at Fordham University. As long as you spell my name properly with the SCH that you can probably see now on the Zoom, it shouldn't be too hard to find me. And I'm happy, honestly, to share responses to questions you might have or help facilitate you finding appropriate books or otherwise. Of course, there's a whole world to learn about, and I haven't assigned homework since I don't think that's really the approach here, the spirit alive of spirit. Um, of course. But in any event, that doesn't mean that I'm not happy to make suggestions if you like or answer questions. Like, please, please, please don't be a stranger. And I think we might as well dig in because we have some time together this evening, so to take advantage. All right, so we're going to start here with the briefest of review as we always do, and we'll try to be relatively quick about it. Right, as a reminder, we've now seen this slide a whole number of times, right? Early teaching, perhaps the foundational teaching of the Buddha, preaching this four truths, and we explored suffering, different ways of thinking about the reality of suffering, which is the reality of instability and change. Then we added to that story when we talked about karma. So our past experiences, both in this lifetime and lifetime, contributing to the sense of instability, which is part of the first suffering of change. Not to mention the fact that all of the coping that we do with our suffering and our instinctive responses to our environment that are built up through our habits cause new problems, right? Even when we're addressing issues in our present, we often plant the seeds for future discomfort, and seeds growing into fruit, into plants and fruit is a very common metaphor in Indian philosophy. And sadly, at this moment in the discussion, what comes to fruition isn't exclusively misery as such, but on some level is dissatisfaction or suffering. And then we said way back when at the first session, and again when we were talking about karma, that the cause of suffering isn't actually the reality of instability and change, but it's our responses to it, which habitually mentally involve the judgment of phenomena as good or bad or neutral for us. So you see, actually, this judgment is multifaceted. It's not only a judgment of the world around us and the exterior world, which could include, by the way, our feelings and our own body, but it's not just our judgments of the stimuli that we run up against in our experience, but also the presumption that those things exist vis-a-vis ourselves, which gets us to ignorance, which is often cited, especially in later discourses attributed to the Buddha, as the primary cause of suffering. And we talked about this, I believe, in the third session when we explored Buddhist critiques of what we call the self. So our ignorance really has to do with our mental habits. I sometimes in class say the self habit we have. Whatever our philosophical positions are, or our metaphysical self-interpretations or a religious position vis-a-vis ourselves and the divine, whatever kind of fancy talk we might have about ourselves in our more reflective moments. The problem is that we habitually and instinctively treat the world as if it's exterior to us, and we ourselves are some way singular, stable, independent, or separate beings. That's our self habit that we reinforce moment to moment, albeit in inconsistent ways. Sometimes we identify ourselves with, if we have sinus pressure with our mind, sometimes we identify ourselves with our identity or the story we tell ourselves or memories. But regardless, we're constantly kind of engaging the world through judgment that builds on these self habits. So that's really the fundamental cause of suffering in many Buddhist interpretations, the misunderstanding of the self. And then what we did was we said, well, if exploration of the self and breaking down of the habit of identifying as a self that's singular and independent is the solution, how do you go about doing that? And this is the path. Because the end itself is simply the end of the habits of ignorance, desire, craving, attachment, aversion, and so on. Right? In a way, it's the ending of the false judgments that lead to these responses to making things worse. That's what the third piece is. Right? The fourth piece is the path, and we haven't done the entirety of the path, of course, at all. But one of the pieces we added last class had to do with the component of meditation. Meaning it's not enough to just take a Zoom course, although again, I appreciate we're all doing it together, right? But rather, there is a certain training of the mind that's necessary in order for this practice to be successful. So there are many forms of meditation in 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition. And really, no matter where you live in the world, but particularly if you're in my area, in the metropolitan New York City area, there are so many places you can learn about meditation. But for us, we're just going to be exploring three major categories that are really helpful to get a sense of what meditation's for. So last time we talked about concentration practice, insight, and mindfulness. And I want us to spend a little more time on mindfulness as promised because it's become so popular. So here we introduce concentration as tranquility practice, and it's a trick in a way, right? Samatha isn't saying let's put on nice quiet music and sit in the steam room and think happy thoughts, sing the song from The Sound of Music or otherwise, right? But rather, right, the idea here is that we trick our minds into calming down on their own. How do we do so? By focusing all of our energy, our mental energy, onto one object. And then we explored a couple explanations from Ajahn Brahm and others, right, about how when you focus your mind on one thing, things literally fall away. This takes some effort, right? And why do this? Well, there are a number of reasons, and there are nice byproducts of having a calming practice of focus, but at least from the perspective of a path to liberation. The primary requirement is to get sufficiently focused so that you can actually face reality as such. And for our purposes, reality has to do with this world of change, of lack of satisfaction, and especially a world where there is no stable self, right? So that's what demands insight, right? And insight is actually a form or a set of forms of meditation that demand the preparatory concentration, but they're not the same thing as calming. In a way, Vipassana or insight practices, and we mentioned some of them, can be otherwise kind of disturbing, which is why it helps to have a calming practice. Why disturbing? Well, I hope, and I hope you don't blame me for this, but I hope you've been a little bit disturbed over these weeks if you've been taking some of these ideas, especially about no self, seriously. And that's the idea here, to actually face reality as it is. That's at least the presupposition, is going to demand kind of training. In later tradition, they call this armor, the armor of forbearance, right? Imagine like if you've ever gone to the Metropolitan Museum or otherwise, where they have um, literal armor, like metal armor they used to protect knights and the like, right? So same idea. Meditation in a way is your mental armor that allows you not only to focus, but manage the challenge of these insights. But the good news is because we can change our mental habits, right, through repeated familiarity with the nature of reality in the form of something like no self, we can transform our relationship to the world. That's the promise, which is really quite remarkable. And interestingly, the tradition tends to explain that this is actually quite pleasant and even blissful. right? In fact, we limit ourselves by holding on so tightly to our mental understandings, our predispositions, even our values, our morality, what we like, what we dislike, our self-understanding, our constant interpretation of how we're doing and how others are doing. In a way, this is a tightening that can be loosened, right? One common metaphor is to say, like, if all of these different aspects of ourselves, physical but mostly mental, are like a bundle of sticks, right? Then liberation, in a sense, is just untying the bundle, right? Which itself is a loosening of this suffering. And here are just some examples of the kinds of things that Buddhists traditionally, at least those who apply themselves to this path, might generate insight into. So we've talked about this, right? Why meditation? Because all of the reasons I just suggested. All right. And then this is where we ended pretty quickly, but I want to expand on this conversation a little bit. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun here. It is our last session, we're allowed, right? To think about this term mindfulness, which is a perfectly good translation of the Pali term sati or the Sanskrit term smriti, which is an aspect of meditation. It isn't really meditation as such, but it's an aspect of it. And that's the awareness of what you're doing as you're doing it. We did a funny experiment about this on Zoom last time, right? When you're staring at a computer screen, you are aware staring at a computer screen. When you're trying to conceptualize the Buddhist path, you're aware conceptualizing the Buddhist path. When you're scratching your nose or shifting in your seat or noticing the sound of your neighbors, if you live in an apartment building like myself, or I can hear my kids through the door, or you can hear the wind outside, you notice, right? Hearing the wind outside. And this sounds simple, but in fact, as we talked about, we often jump from the experience of something to the judgments about them. So we might think we're being mindful. Well, yeah, I'm paying attention to my children. I'm having a conversation with my grandkids. I'm carrying out my work assignment. I'm walking from here to there. But really, right, we're not there at all in the sense that our attention is not only divided, but spins into storytelling, right? So mindfulness is really the aspect of meditation. This is where we're going to pick up with here, right? One of the facets of sati that people really like, and we're going to get to kind of the modern application of mindfulness really, really soon, but one of the reasons people like this so much is because mindfulness demands a certain relaxed attitude, even more so than the samatha or single point of concentration we were talking about. This is where things get a little bit tricky. But if you were practicing sati for sati's sake, mindfulness as mindfulness, then in fact, there's a demand of receptivity because anything that's too goal-oriented or singularly focused usually brings with it judgment. Oh, no, no, come back to this, this, this. This is what I should be doing. Oh, I'm doing a decent job watching TV, but I could be doing a better job. I could be watching something better, right? So actually, there's a certain receptive quality to mindfulness. The recognition that you can carry out activities, even conversations or tasks or washing dishes, is a very popular activity to do mindfully in contemporary discussions or teachings, like the very famous, now late Vietnamese teacher Thich Nhat Hanh always talks about mindfulness while washing dishes, right? The idea is if one is simply relaxed and receptive to the experience without judging, then all of a sudden a breath, not breathing breath, but a breath with a D, a breath opens up to experience. You start to notice things you wouldn't otherwise notice. Sometimes in some dramatic renditions or interpretations of what mindfulness can do for you, and I hope we all like this one, right? Mindfulness allows you to navigate your life or open up yourself to your own life or reclaim your own life. None of this is my language. These are quotations from kind of popular renditions of mindfulness that we are now so pervasive in our contemporary cultures. So mindfulness as a facet of meditation, we're going to talk about that, but also as a certain attitude of receptivity, relaxed, kind of embrace of experience without the judgment. It doesn't mean it's all going to be, hearts and roses, as we say, and smiley faces. Right? Of course, there's pain and suffering that's part of our experience that one is receptive to. If you're receptive to your experience, that means being receptive to all of the experience. And yet, without the judgment, all of a sudden, there's kind of a breath of possibility in every day, as opposed to a to-do list and some anxiety and some unpleasant news headlines to read and time to fill, etc., or even boredom to struggle with, right? Or responsibilities. Right? All of a sudden, each day is open with the unknown. It doesn't mean you're going to be abducted by aliens necessarily or become enlightened, right? Although I guess that would be interesting. But rather to say there are all these small kind of micro moments of possibility that we usually don't notice. So I hope you're getting a little sense of the romance of mindfulness, which is setting us up for where we're going in the next couple of slides. All right. So look, traditionally, if you'll give me a minute here, right, sati, which has been a facet of Buddhist teachings, especially attributed to the Buddha, Buddhist teachings about concentration practice from the very beginning are really just a small facet of what single point in concentration. Why? Because with judgment and thinking, it's very hard to become calm. So imagine you take the object of a candle flame. What many people do when they're learning to meditate is try to psych themselves out or give themselves a pep talk. Today is the day I focus, right? I unerringly on a candle flame. And then what happens is you're looking at a candle flame and then you start making associations and you remember things you have to buy from the supermarket or whatever. Maybe you have a positive memory about offering a votive candle at a church and then you think about a person you lost or whatever it might be, right? And then you're lost. And then what happens is, and this is very common for all of us, is you get angry at yourself. You say, oh, Josh, I'm the person teaching the Zoom. How could I have blown my own meditation, right? I thought I knew about this stuff. What's wrong with you? I better try again. Or I could never meditate. Or no, I got to add 5 minutes to my timer now, or whatever it means. Or maybe candle flames aren't my thing. I should find a mantra to chant or a different color. In any event, if I'm sounding neurotic, it's because I am. But part of the idea is that we all are, in a sense, right? And meditation can quickly devolve into thinking. Aha. So where does this have to do with sati? Well, sati, as awareness of what's happening as it's happening, is gentler, meaning simply noticing that you're thinking, ah, I was fantasizing about that time with the candle at church, itself is enough to bring you back. You don't need to coach yourself back and get lost in the thinking. The mindfulness is the component where you simply notice, ah, thinking, come back, right? Feel like itching my back, come back. Distracted by a noise, come back. So in a certain kind of light touch, which is also vocabulary you sometimes hear in meditation instruction, the certain light touch of mindfulness that in a way is always potentially present, we just don't notice it. The light touch of mindfulness is what guides concentration practice. Okay, so this is a very early sense of what mindfulness is for, almost interchangeable with concentration practice. What's happened actually, interestingly, because of reforms in South and primarily Southeast Asian meditation styles over the last couple hundred years or 150 years, is an increase in emphasis on sati or mindfulness itself as a form of insight. What does this mean? The idea here is that if instead of having a goal-oriented practice like single point of concentration, granted, you might begin by noticing your breathing to get grounded or the feeling of your body on your seat. But a certain open and relaxed attitude towards whatever is arising itself, if you think about it, is necessarily a familiarizing oneself with change, because that's what comes up. So I invite you to try this if you like. We're not going to pause because, we have a recording. And if you have a recording, you can pause on your own, kind of in the spirit of trying to take advantage of the time we have together. I'm going to keep on talking, so you excuse me for doing so. But you can imagine if you're watching the recording, just pausing and trying this, or even as you listen along. Notice in a relaxed sense how many different sensations arise even as you're simply listening or participating in the Zoom. And as we begin to notice without the judging and the jumping and the trying to be efficient about, right, without the goal-oriented self-talk, right? with all of the driving to do a good job or a bad job or otherwise, when you allow yourself to just notice, what you notice is the constant shifting of experiences. This is the argument. And you could try it. And I think you'll find that that's the case. Now, it's easy to get distracted and lose it, which is why it's a practice. But you could see, I hope, and I'm happy to answer questions about this at the end, that a certain structure of mindfulness as relaxed, receptive, non-judgmental awareness of what's happening really is a noticing or attending to change. Not because you're judging it or you're going to write a college paper about it or you're going to write a poem about it, but just the noticing of it. And the idea here that some very famous Burmese and Sri Lankan or Sinhala teachers have spoken about and others is that actually this moment you start to familiarize yourself with change, it means you're familiarizing yourself with the unsatisfactoriness of things, not because every experience in sati or mindfulness practice is miserable, but it's not lasting. None of the experiences are lasting sources of happiness. They come and they go. And the other thing that comes and goes are all your experiences or sensations of yourself. And you start to notice that this story we have of being a consistent, singular, independent being starts to make less and less sense when we actually attend to what it's like to be us from moment to moment. Okay, this is a big pitch. There are plenty of places to look for more instructions on this, but this is one of the more popular ways in the last, let's say, 50, 60 years to present no self insight practices as an extension of mindfulness. So mindfulness itself can be part of a single pointed concentration practice, or it can be a technique for insight. Or in a way, and this is what we're going to get to, it can be a practice separated from a Buddhist path to liberation. Now, this story, and we're not going to do the history of it in total, is complex like any historical story is. But the really short version is that once in the United States, mindfulness instructions start to come over from Asia, both because people in the United States went traveling to Southeast Asia and South Asia and brought back teachings after they did meditation there, as well as immigration opened up in the United States, right post 1965, you start to have more and more Buddhist meditation teachers in the United States, not to mention translations of treatises and the like. In any event, as more people start to meditate, there was more of an inspiration to send out, maybe send isn't the right word, but introduce these techniques to people who didn't grow up Buddhist. It's quite common. And in the 80s, something really interesting happens, which is that a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who's a quite famous teacher, decides that he wants to try teaching mindfulness to his patients at the UMass Medical Center in Massachusetts, which is, I believe, in Worcester, Western Mass, or in central Massachusetts, right? And therefore decides he has to present mindfulness itself as secular practice because he's teaching at a or working at a public hospital. And so this necessity to kind of navigate the public, private, religious, right, challenges of government-funded institutions in the United States spearheads, or let's say motivates, Kabat-Zinn and others like him, right, to start to present mindfulness-style teachings as non-Buddhist. And I wouldn't say that Kabat-Zinn doesn't think that they're Buddhist. He himself proudly identifies as Buddhist and knows a lot about what he's talking about, but there's a certain, let's say, advantage that many contemporary teachers in this vein find in presenting mindfulness as simply training of the mind, which, if you think about it, doesn't have to be Buddhist. There's nothing on the screen that demands religious commitment, despite the fact that, as I suggested probably in the first couple of classes, there's plenty of aspects of real Buddhist life for people who identify as Buddhist and belong to communities that looks as religious as any other religion, right? But here, mental training is secular. So why do I say this? Because what you start to find in the 80s, but then it really takes off in the 90s and then the aughts and now today, is a world where mindfulness gets applied to all sorts of activities. They're not even restricted to meditation on the seat. You don't have to be sitting on a cushion or in a chair anywhere. So just two very common examples would be books like this in really the either the wellness space or the self-improvement space or the therapeutic space, which are all interrelated, of course, of something like mindful parenting, right? It's not enough to love your kids or be strategic or send them to the proper school, right? But rather bringing mindful, non-judgmental attention to the act of parenting in the first place. Really common. Why not? Is this Buddhist? I don't know. Does it have to be Buddhist? No. Does it come from Buddhist teachings? Probably. But regardless, now you see pieces like this all the time, especially in the book world, which now is the podcast world, etc., right? Or mindful work. And there's a whole industry, literally an industry of teaching mindfulness practices in corporate contexts and corporate settings, right? So Google famously introduced mindfulness meditation breaks for employees, and you have them all over the corporate world, right? It's certainly not just Silicon Valley. So here what you have is a real transformation of mindfulness from an aspect of the Buddhist path to something like an attitudinal suggestion for all people living in the United States and elsewhere. And I'm sure you've heard some of this talk. Right? And just to show one example, this is kind of funny. So here's some lightness here. This is a real advertisement. I didn't make this up. This is mindful mayonnaise. What's mindful about mayonnaise? I don't know, beats me. But the idea here is that mindfulness isn't even connected to a Buddhist context or Buddhist monks. We're going to get back to that in a minute. Or even in this context, meditation, right? Mindfulness is just a brand here, right? I don't know. What's better than normal mayonnaise? Mindful mayonnaise. Does that mean it's more healthy for you? I doubt it, right? But you get the idea, right? I hope. So here we see kind of a transformation of Buddhist meditation practices through complicated historical steps that we've skipped out of the context of something like the gradual path to liberation or the gradual path to spiritual awakening. Remember that? That's our title for this class. And now into the kind of a popular imagination. By the way, students always want to ask about this, and I don't know if this is your concern, but I don't know that this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an interesting thing, right? How different these meditations look in different contexts, right? I don't think there's anything inauthentic about contemporary mindfulness practice, but some pieces of it are just different. And in a way, before we open up the questions, I want to emphasize one aspect of this difference that's really significant. That's a real challenge, I think, for people certainly living in the United States, as well as for American Buddhists of all kinds. And that is a reminder of the original context, social context of monastic practice. And perhaps some kind of familiarity amongst the sisters here in the crowd. Maybe this will make you guys happy. I don't know. But the idea that really at the center of Buddhist approaches to confronting suffering, traditionally and even into the present day, has been a commitment to unique monastic communities that themselves are not the same as who do not engage in the same everyday practices as all of the lay people, the non-monks and nuns. Does not mean these teachings, ideas, and even meditations can't be applicable to and help everyday folks on the one hand. On the other hand, they not only grew in, but in some cases demand, right, the kind of nurturing within a monastic environment. So I just want to talk about that for a minute as maybe a corrective to mindful mayonnaise. What I mean by that is just to say a corrective to our instinct that Buddhist ideas, which we all hear about all the time, right, are just easily, let's say, either palatable or consumable for any folks, regardless of their religious commitment. By the way, many people in the current moment have different attitudes and positions, smart people who disagree about this. And I think the monastic piece often gets forgotten about for good reason in the United States. One, because, as I'm sure some people here know, it's hard to maintain monasteries or monastic communities, formal or otherwise. It's expensive. And our political structure doesn't support them, right? And certainly for Buddhist communities that have arisen here in the United States, separate from, right, their cultural homes where they were centuries and centuries, in some case millennia of time, to develop kind of co-develop relationships with or kind of the aristocracy or the political powers or the king or whoever it might be that supports monasteries, right? In the United States is a challenge. Basically, Buddhist monasteries in the United States are functionally just nonprofits, right? And so functioning that way is really challenging and expensive. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So I don't know if a corrective is exactly the right word, but let's say it's a reminder. So a little bit of this, and I'm going to try to integrate some storytelling so that we don't all go to sleep here together on our final Thursday night. Let's jump into a couple slides, then some, I hope, dramatic quotations from you from great Buddhist texts. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this monasticism slide. This category, and we always have numbers in this class from Indian Buddhism, right, is an introduction to what's called the three trainings. This is a very, very old summary of different strategies that must work together in order to bring about something like liberation from suffering, or at least a loosening of our mental habits of suffering, right? The second one, concentration, we've just talked about to some extent. The third one, insight, which involves not only study, but also forms of meditation, we've definitely just spoken about. But the idea is that traditionally, for disciples of the Buddha 2,500 years ago and on to the present day, right, these practices are built upon and matched with morality or discipline practices. And here, this isn't simply the idea that in order to understand the nature of reality, you need to generate virtuous habits of kindness, concern, patience, generosity, and limit your karmically negative or potentially harmful activities of selfishness, desire, anger, jealousy, pride, and so on. Of course, these are teachings that can apply to all human beings, but rather that these habits, moral habits, and mental disciplines arise best within the context of taking vows. That's what monastic rules are. These are promises that you need to actually make that are binding to you. And they only work in communities. No one can do it on their own. Now, there are stories of what are called solitary Buddhas. People just disappear, they're hermits. You never hear from them again, and then poof, they're liberated, right? So there are, of course, there is this kind of, let's say, trajectory of independent practice of people who literally drop out. And we're going to talk a lot about dropping out in a minute. But generally speaking, the dropping out only works if supported by community. And this is a really old idea, and it's by no means exclusively Buddhist, but it's a nice reminder, I think, since so many of us encounter Buddhism, whether it's in videos or in podcasts or in books you can buy, right, as some kind of independent project of like spiritual consumption that's available to us in our modern age. Again, this is just kind of a common way for us to learn about things, right? In our contemporary culture. I don't think it's inherently bad, but it's different. Okay, so the idea here is that really, and this is the position I think of the early tradition, meditation practice and insight into no self and the like is pretty meaningless if you're not a monk or a nun. Not because on the margins it's not going to help you, but frankly, most of us have too much other stuff to do, right? And we're too caught up with our habits of making money or taking care of family members or watching TV or betting on football or whatever it is, right? And so really, these practices come alive in supportive communities that are bound by rules. So the rules is a really important piece. Okay, so just a couple examples. There are competing lineages of monastic training, what's called Vinaya, Vinaya. We're not going to talk much about it here, but just to say, one of the big distinctions between early Buddhist communities was which rules they followed. But there's plenty of overlap in these rules, and in the different Vinaya, there's usually between 225 and 250 something rules for monks, and you might think this is interesting. The nuns, there is an early tradition of female followers of Buddhist teachings in monastic communities. Started, the story goes, by his aunt who actually raised him, who kind of had to heckle him for permission because he didn't want to ordain nuns at first. So it's kind of an interesting, provocative story. But in any event, in these communities that emerged after the time of the Buddha, of nuns, they always had more rules. So we could argue about why that is, but that's a whole another interesting, provocative, separate class. Okay, so what kind of rules here, right? Well, there are many, 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 right? And they're all quite detailed, but they involve, for example, celibacy, which of course is a huge one, right? But also dietary practices, not eating after midday, not handling money, which is a big restriction. Think about that in the United States, right? And alms rounds. The basic idea is you don't really even cook for yourself, right? The idea is that you beg for food. That's part of your renunciation of or rejection of the normal everyday activities, physical habits, verbal habits, and mental habits that other people generate. Now, in fairness, right, over 2,500 years, there have been many different monastic strategies. Not all monks and nuns or communities of them still do alms rounds where they beg with a begging bowl necessarily. There are other ways for them to get fed or supported, right? Even financially, right? Again, Buddhists, of course, are real human beings. So all sorts of different strategies have emerged throughout the Asian world. But it is important to say, to just understand where the tradition came from. And you still do have monks, even in New York City, who follow a lot of these rules. Okay, so monasticism. Again, it doesn't mean that this is unavailable to people in the United States, but it's a challenge even for Buddhist communities to set up successful, lasting monastic communities. There are some exceptions, but it's a little bit of a challenge. I hope this is all making sense. A little bit more here before we get to the fun part of it. Because monasticism isn't just a social challenge. What do I mean by that? It's not just a challenge to get the building, build the building, get all the monks or nuns fed, keep people together, have everyone follow the rules, nobody ruin the reputation of the community, which was a big concern at the time of the Buddha, right? That people would wear the robes of a monk and go begging, but then really steal people's money or take advantage or otherwise, right? So the reputation of the community, very, very important. I'm sure a lot of people know about that, right? Maintaining the kind of moral purity of a community is no joke in the history of Buddhist tradition. But in any event, it's not just a social problem, right? But it's also, in a way, a moral attitude. And that's the attitude of renunciation. And we see this in the life of the Buddha, we're going to talk about in a second, which is to say that to follow the moral requirements of being a monk or a nun and have sufficient time and kind of mental approach or a sufficiently refined mental approach to do concentration practice and then build to insight practice demands certain basic social steps of giving up. This is the dropping out part I was talking about earlier. Right? And Buddha Shakyamuni, the Buddha from 2,500 years ago, as the story goes, which we're going to look at one brief moment from his story, as the story goes, was born as a prince in a place called Kapilavastu, which you could visit. It's in Nepal. Um, was a prince who lived the first 20 plus years of his life as kind of a privileged monk. Excuse me, as a privileged prince in a palace. And the idea is that he, through kind of convincing his dad to let him go out on some field trips, witnesses the suffering of old age, sickness, and death, and his whole experience is transformed. So it's a really beautiful story. We're not going to focus on all of it right now. But the idea here is that for the Buddha to become Buddha, he had to literally give up his responsibilities. And this is not some modern conception of fiscal responsibility or moral responsibility or familial responsibility or rugged individualism that we're projecting. Rather, as I'm going to prove to you in a minute, the concern over this prince giving up his and abandoning his familial and social responsibilities to his father to become the next king so his dad could retire, right? And to his family, by the way, he had just gotten married to a wonderful woman named Yashodhara, and he just had a kid, this cute boy named Rahula. Siya abandons them all. And they notice, as everyone does. In fact, people are really pissed about it. That's the story. So there's an anxiety about what we call dharma, which is a huge topic, right? But dharma in this context means something like your moral and social responsibilities, which involve, by the way, religious responsibilities. And the idea here is that for the Buddha to get to the bottom of things, to face reality as is, he had to drop all of that. There's just no time. In fact, to simplify, there were theories at the time that are developed in some Hindu texts or Brahmanic texts that essentially pursuit of liberation is a retirement project, which is a slight translation. But it really is true that once one fulfills one's familial responsibilities, especially if you're a male and you do your job and you pass on whatever your family's job is to your son or your sons, then you can retire, literally go out to the forest, give up your responsibilities, and get to the bottom of things. But until then, please do your job. right? Which includes, amongst other things, taking care of your family and your parents and everyone else. Okay, so what's the point? People are really worried about this because becoming a monk or a nun is a real moral sacrifice in the sense that you're not doing what everyone else is doing. Now, again, and I apologize for all the caveats, but it is important to recognize over 2,500 years, not every monk or nun has actually abandoned their family. And it's very common, especially in Southeast Asian communities, that families are really proud to send their kids to monasteries in Tibet as well. And there's some kind of familial connection that's maintained. And yet, and there's evidence of this in contemporary Tibetan communities, I should say. There's some really great movies about this, right? You are making a sacrifice if you send your kid off to the monastery. They're not going to help you with the farming or in the village or otherwise, right? It's like one less set of hands to provide labor to help take care of the family. So the idea that you're abandoning your family by renouncing them is still an ongoing moral challenge, even in a context where Buddhist teachings have been prominent for years and years and years. So I just want to give you two examples of evidence here from stories, which I think will be a fun way to end the presentation part of our chat today, of how worried people were historically, and I would argue they still are because these stories are quite popular, about the sacrifices that are necessary for becoming a monk, right? What are the sacrifices that human beings are willing to or even capable of kind of achieving in the spirit of renunciation? And so our examples here are from narratives of the Buddha. The first one is from, and we're going to do a little reading from a text called the Buddha Charita, which literally means the life of the Buddha or the going of the Buddha. You see this author Ashvaghosha is the author in Sanskrit, in a beautiful poetic Sanskrit, of this version of the life of the Buddha. He inherits from various sermons and other stories about the Buddha the structure of the story, but he dramatizes it. And this text, most scholars think is from the first, maybe the second century of the Common Era. So, it's 2,000 years old, but of course comes hundreds of years after the Buddha died. But the Ashvaghosha text is a really fantastic example of the dramatization of how pissed everyone gets at Siddhartha. That's the name of the prince before he becomes Buddha, how pissed I get for him for leaving. And there are these passionate moral debates. It's really a beautiful text about the ethical implications of what? Of renouncing. So I'm going to show you a quick passage about that. The second story, which if we get to, is perhaps the most popular Buddhist story in the whole world, certainly in Southeast Asia, and that's what's called the Vasantara Jataka, which is a story about the Buddha, but not when he becomes the Buddha, the lifetime before he's reborn as Siddhartha the prince, right? So this is the Buddha before he's the Buddha, but it's usually understood to be his last lifetime before he's reborn as the future Buddha, right? And in this case, there's another dramatic example of renunciation. So in the first case, just to summarize, in case we run out of time to do the reading together, in the Buddha Charita, the Buddha is at this moment abandoning in a chariot in the middle of the night his kingdom. His dad wants him to stay. He wants him to become the king. Of course, his wife wants him to stay and help take care of the kids. All of his friends want him to stay. The whole kingdom wants him to stay. There's a real kind of freak out about, right, this prince losing his resolution to fulfill his social responsibilities. So we're going to get an example of that. Vasantara is even more dramatic. The Vasantara Jataka is also a story about the prior Buddha. His name is Vasantara, as a prince, or really in this case as a king, but he's so obsessed with generosity that he keeps on giving stuff away. So he lives in this kingdom with a magical elephant. It's a fun story that provides protection and care for everyone in the kingdom. But then the folks next door in the state next door, they come ask him, they say they've heard that Vasantara is a really generous guy. So they say, Vasantara, can we have your elephant? And he says, yeah, of course. I'll give away everything. What do we need the elephant for? It's yours. And then you can imagine the kingdom's not so happy about this because his primary responsibility as a king is to protect his kingdom. He's given away the magic elephant, right? So not surprisingly, he loses office. He gets kicked out. This is a great PR failure for his administration. But then he's got to go wander around. He's off in the forest with his kids and his wife. And then there's a number of incidents that occur. And one of them is he's confronted with a really mean, nasty priest. There's some interreligious gamemanship going on in the story. But in any event, this kind of nasty priest shows up and he says, hey, Vasantara, I heard you're a nice guy. How about you give me your kids and then eventually your wife? And I hate to tell you, He says yes. So this is one of the most popular Buddhist stories, and we're going to come back to it in a second. But just to show you that the communities were worried about the ethics of this. To be a Buddha, to renounce, to give up your attachment to your responsibilities, not just to yourself, but to everyone around you, is this a moral demand that human beings are capable of? And is it even ethical? And if it is ethical on some transcendental level, are we human beings even capable of understanding it? So these are two examples of how the problem of monasticism and the more fundamental issue of renunciation, as in a way a prerequisite from going through this gradual path, at least in the fall semester, right, is a real challenge to communities. These are real smart human beings worrying about the moral implications. So to, I hope, make this a little bit more interesting, I think we should look at some stories, at least a couple moments of text. Let's see how it goes. All right, so the first one is from Buddhacharita. And here we see a passage where the Buddha, he's not Buddha yet, he's still the prince, Siddhartha. He's just run away from the kingdom with his buddy Chanda or Chandaka, who is his charioteer, right? This is the guy who's like in charge of the stable, grabs the best horse, and they take off, right? Okay, so now they've escaped, and Chandaka's having some doubts, right? He's saying, what did I do? Was this the right move to steal away the prince, right? And so this is what Chandaka is saying, in a way, speaking for the audience, which if we'd all read the text or heard it told or watched it performed, we would all be thinking the same things. And here it's delivered dramatically. This is just beautiful. I don't know if you can see me. This is a beautiful rendition by a great scholar named Patrick Olivelle of this Sanskrit text, right? Poetically in English, rendering the Sanskrit to explain the kind of pathos of the moment. Okay, so this is what Chandaka says. He says, please do not, therefore, O mighty armed prince, forsake the king who so longs for his son. He's talking about Shuddhodana, who is the future Buddha's father. Like infidels forsaking true Dharma, Dharma is the word for social responsibility, essentially. Like infidels forsaking Dharma, please do not forsake that tender old king, right? Who abandons their elderly father, right? Leaves him hanging literally and emotionally. Please do for not forget that second mother of yours, the queen exhausted by bringing you up like an ingrate who forgets a good deed. Notice this is Chandaka calling the future Buddha an ingrate. Why a second mother? Because pretty soon after the Buddha dies or the prince dies, his mother Maya dies herself. Excuse me. Pretty soon after the prince is born, the future Buddha is born, his mother dies. So he's raised by the second mother, who's usually understood to be his aunt, right? So he's abandoned her too. This woman who made this incredible sacrifice to raise Siddhartha, the future Buddha, he just left her. What kind of a person does that? Please do not abandon that virtuous queen, faithful to her lord with an infant son. Notice he doesn't leave like after his bar mitzvah or something like that, right? He leaves him, he's an infant, he's brand new, right? This cute, adorable kid Rahula. The queen who's born in an illustrious line, like a sissy his inherited crown. This is a modern day translation, but it probably captures the tone pretty well. Like, what kind of a person does that? Where's your heroism to take care of your son? And by the way, there are beautiful passages in the Buddhacharita of how upset his wife is, right? Please don't abandon your son, Yashodhara's illustrious child. Yashodhara is his wife. Best bearer of Dharma and fame, like a villain, the highest fame, right? So who is the Buddha? He's an ingrate. He's a sissy. He's a villain. You guys weren't expecting this today, were you? Right? If, however, you've made up your mind to abandon your father and kingdom, please don't abandon me, my Lord, for your feet are my sole refuge. Right? Basically meaning he's humbling himself. So here, like the beauty of even a close friend who's just made a big sacrifice, he's run away from him. So you can feel the kind of poetic pathos, yeah, in this narrative that's asking you, in a way, right, inviting you to get really upset with the Buddha for making the sacrifice. Now, obviously, the story works out. And by the way, the Buddha goes back and he invites his wife and his son and his aunt, who raises him, to become part of the community of monks and nuns. And, he makes things right in a certain sense, although he never becomes the king again. But you see that this problem of renunciation is no small matter for Buddhist communities. Even in communities where monasticism is standard, is at the centerpiece of Buddhist communities. where monks have become doctors, healers, ritual experts. They oversee funerals. They're educators, often major monasteries in Buddhist cultures, or sometimes function as universities, right? They're central in a way to society. In a way, monks and monasteries aren't necessarily dropouts. In some cases, they're the center of society. Even still, these stories are told and told and told. Why? Because people are worried about it, right? Buddhists are human beings, and they're worried about whether or not this is too big of a sacrifice. The demands of the pursuit of the gradual path to liberation, even if it's to benefit everyone by maintaining and spreading the instructions that help people deal with their suffering, demands a high price. And if you think that's a high price, for dramatic purposes so that we all remember something from this class. And I almost apologize for doing so, but I'm a mean professor, so I like doing things like this. I apologize, but not really. Let's really see what the sacrifice looked like in the story of Vasantara. Remember him? So this is, I hope, our PowerPoint slide, right? We're now looking at the second example of this Vasantara Jataka. Jatakas are really popular stories about what the Buddha was up to generate good karma, meaning to generate the proper moral discipline so that he even had the right to be born as the prince who became the Buddha. You're not just born as the prince who becomes Buddha, I hate to tell you all, unfortunately, right? You go through lifetimes of training. So that's what the Jataka stories are. Sometimes he's a human being, sometimes he's a king, sometimes he's an animal. In each case, he's learning some kind of or perfecting some kind of set of moral disciplines. Okay, so in Vasantara, he's perfecting the moral discipline of generosity, which sounds a lot nicer than it is when we see the story. Here, let's jump in to easily the most famous and disturbing moment. All right. Hopefully you can see this. All right, so this is from Vasantara Jataka, which is one version of the story. The story, by the way, is quite old. It's probably the case that we had Vasantara Jataka already by the third century, the 200s before the Common Era, so a couple hundred years after the time of Buddha. It's possible that this story of the past life of the Buddha is even older. And this appears, of course, in English translation from a really famous Pali, which is a South Asian language, Pali formalization of the story. That's very dramatic. So you ready for the drama? This is a bit of a warning. I don't think you're going to like it. Okay. After he had given this gift, this is Vasantara, has given the gift of his two children. They're kids, by the way. Full of joy because he had given so good a gift, he realizes the significance of training himself to not be attached to self, not be attached to what's sometimes called me and mine. They're not my kids anymore. I'm perfecting overcoming attachment by being generous. The great being, that's Buddha. Well, it's not Buddha yet. It's Vasantara, stood still watching his children. Uh-oh. Jujaka, this is the mean priest. That's how he's portrayed in the text. Jujaka went into a forest thicket and biting off a creeper, which is like a vine or a plant, used it to bind together the boy's right hand and the girl's left hand. Beating him with the ends of the creeper, he went off with them. In explanation, the teacher said, then that cruel Brahmin, a Brahmin in this case is a priest, bit off a creeper. With the creeper, he bound their hands. With the creeper, he thrashed them. If you didn't like it the first time, we're getting it second time in verse. Then holding a rope and a stick, the Brahmin, the priest led them away, beating them while the prince looked on. Where they were beaten, the skin broke and the blood flowed, and as they were beaten, they pressed back to back. And this goes on for a little bit. What's the point? This dramatization is forcing us, yeah, into an experience of really trauma, right? For the kids and anger at Visantara. What kind of a person does this? Look, it's possible he gave away the kids to somebody nice, put them in a foster home of loving parents, but that's not the story. The story is he gives them away to somebody. Was he so stupid, the future Buddha, that didn't know that this was a mean priest, right? We understand this is going to be a moral challenge. A little bit more coming, and we can talk about it. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit. Okay. Overpowering grief rose up in the great being. By the way, the kids have run away from the priest, come back to dad, and dad says, sorry, I can't take you. You got to go to the priest. I gave you away. So even after witnessing this, all right, overpowering grief rose up in the great being. This is again the future Buddha for his children, and his heart grew hot, trembling like a rutting elephant. And the rutting elephant means an elephant that's like in heat, right? Which is a classic Sanskrit metaphor. Trembling like a rutting elephant seized by a maned lion, or like the moon caught in the jaws of eclipse, his feelings unable to bear it, he went into the leaf hut with eyes full of tears and wept bitterly. All right, so now I hope we're feeling a little bit better. At least this is a human being. He's perceived the suffering of kids and he's upset, right? In explanation, then Vasantara, prince of noble birth, having given that gift, went to the leafy hut and wept bitterly. And then we have some lament. All right, but lest we get too excited, the great being, feeling his affectation, or excuse me, his affection for his children, that the Brahmin was treating them too cruelly and unable to bear the grief, of course, just like us, hearing the story or Vasantara is very commonly put on as a play. It's a little bit like at Christmas time in the United States, right? When you have kind of dramatizations of the life of Jesus, right? Same story. You have kids performing Vasantara Jataka. There's operas of Vasantara. There's beautiful dramatic renditions of it. This is a living story, right? Okay. So you can imagine watching this living story and experiencing this grief and then noticing how upset the great being is as well, right? So you're finally saying, all right, maybe the Buddha is a little bit more like us. Yeah, hold that thought. The great being, feeling his affection for his children, that the Brahmin was treating them too cruelly, and unable, just like us, to bear the grief, considered running after the Brahmin and killing him, and so bringing back the children. But a second thought convinced them that this was impossible. For to wish to redeem a gift once offered, because the suffering of children is too painful, is not the way of good men. What does the Buddha realize? No, no, no. I can't become the future Buddha. So Vasanta recognizes to master generosity means not to give in to these small-minded feelings of pity for my kids. If I'm really going to learn to give up attachment, I give them away. Period. How is that for a story? This is probably the most famous Buddhist story in huge swaths of the world. And by the way, this isn't a celebration. There are plenty of explanations of first, or plenty of evidence of first, critical interpretations of this text where people say, what's wrong with Visantra? That's not right. Or the opposite, which is monks saying, oh, small-minded people think that he did it wrong, but he knew in the end it was all going to work out. And by the way, the story resolves itself happily at the end eventually. And this was the only way that he could become the Buddha in a future lifetime, by working on generosity and becoming more skillful. So then he could become the Buddha and give everyone the teachings, which is going to help everybody. You see this? The bigger picture thinking, right? But then there's also examples of people going to the story and crying. There are famous renditions of people watching the performance and yelling at the Buddha, don't give the kids away, don't give them away, what's wrong with you, right? Kind of like you imagine if you go to the movies and people yell at the movie screen. That happens in New York a lot. In any event, what's the idea? The idea is that this is supposed to be a problem, right? And yet it's a beautiful story and it's a problem. And it's a beautiful story and it's a problem. You can think about your favorite religious stories if you're familiar with them, right? So again, we're going to conclude here in just a second here, not with any kind of singular resolution, because I'm not kind enough to do that. I apologize. But just to suggest that this idea of renunciation, of what it takes to give up attachment to your normal life, but also the moral kind of entrapment that we all find each other in normal society. This is a tremendous challenge in the early Buddhist tradition and ongoing for Buddhists. Is it necessary to really give up, drop out, abandon your family and responsibilities in order to pursue the moral training of following vows, the meditative training of concentration practice, and the insight to recognize that you don't exist the way you think you do, and therefore to break down the habits of suffering? Is this something real human beings are capable of? Is it for everybody? Is it even the right thing to do? Now, obviously, there's some sense that there's great value to these paths in Buddhist communities, but also it's definitely not for everybody. I don't mean on the Zoom. I mean, within Buddhist communities, a real concern. Not everyone can do this, which in a way is a real corrective to our assumptions about mindful mayonnaise, right? We buy the right we buy the right product or we do a weekend or two of mindfulness meditation, and all of a sudden we've gone to the heart of Buddhist teachings. I'm not suggesting anyone is thinking that on the Zoom, but you do see this kind of talk today, that Buddhist teachings are mostly just about mindful relaxation and being more efficient or more aware, and everything else is just commentary. I'm not sure that that's fair, right? And I think these stories, which are still popular, remind us of that, of this like ongoing living moral challenge of whether it's even the right thing to renounce and become a monk or a nun. All right, so that's plenty of my talk, especially now that I've introduced provocative texts and maybe made everyone worried on the Zoom. So if anyone would like to ask some questions about anything we've talked about over the 5 weeks, I'll do my very best to respond. And if you guys want to talk about Vasantara, that makes me happy too. I'm happy to do that. Anyone, please. Are you all mad? Do you feel cheated? Confused? Students love this. People like riot in class sometimes when we do Vasantara. That's a little dramatic, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. How could this story be so popular, people say? One of the things I like about teaching it is because it really brings to the fore this challenge that maybe the path towards overcoming suffering isn't something that most people are capable of. Maybe not never. That's why it goes through lifetimes of rebirth before people can fulfill the path. But the fact that it's not like it's an exclusivist teaching for special folks necessarily, but because it's really hard to emotionally transform our habitual attachments to ourself and others. Our attachments to self and others are not just about being like self-centered narcissists. I don't think that's the case at all. But rather, we're bound up in socially embedded expectations of what it means to be a good person, right? It's challenging. Well, the folks who are here, if you like, and don't want to speak up, which is totally fine. I know it's been a long semester here or a mini semester or whatever we call these online courses. You can also feel free to dump some ideas into the chat that I can respond to now, or we can think about, especially as we readdress some of these questions in pretty different social contexts come the spring. What material, I wonder, maybe you all can note down for the folks who are still here, that we've covered this semester, would you most like to return to, were you able to? Would you be most curious about Buddhist narratives? Do you want to hear more about no self? Do you like meditation instruction, or at least discussion of meditation instruction? What are you most curious about if you only had one more Zoom to live through? In my experience in the classroom, it's very, very often meditation for good reason. Because, by the way, mindfulness meditation and single point meditation can be transformative for many, many, many people. And I think there's often a certain concern and a guilt, which hopefully no one has here, about the applicability of these kinds of meditation teachings separate from the traditions that they maybe came from. Yeah. And so there's gets to be kind of this anxiety. Now, that might be a generational thing. Maybe it's just the younger students are very worried about that, but I'm always surprised. So we have one vote here for no self. Is there something about no self that's most troubling? Is it that it's emotionally challenging to confront this possibility? Or is it just conceptually it's so strange? All of which could be the case. I'm curious if anyone has more questions about no self. What piece of it is bothering you so much? I love this question here that's in this chat also about narratives. I think this is a kind of an important story, stories of success. I think in just about every Buddhist community, there are devotional practices geared towards not only living masters or teachers, but also the teachers of the past, so that one literally lives in a world of, to use this vocabulary, or from Carolyn or Carolina, my apologies, um, to live in a world of successes, right? So in certain cultures, like Tibetan cultures, it's very, I wouldn't say it's mundane, but it's regular that people understand themselves to be living with beings who have achieved some kind of realization. Whereas in Southeast Asian tradition, even though there's deep respect for monks and nuns, there's a slightly different recognition about how challenging it is to get liberated from suffering. That's the material we've been focusing on here. But in either case, there's plenty of stories of what we might consider to be something like saints or great heroes, both artistic representations and stories about them. Yeah, because it really is possible. That's the claim. And it's challenging. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the concept of no self that's so hard. I think one of the problems is, and again, I'm happy to hear from you if people want to jump in, is that it feels like it's a real sacrifice, right? Well, I've organized my life around not only fulfilling some kind of a satisfying life, but I'm sure everyone's quite generous in this community here, right? Also, like a sense of a life well lived for others. And that has to do with not only like my personal satisfactions, making sure, I read enough books and go to see enough art, travel enough, whatever it might be, eat enough good food, but also that like you've lived up to a narrative life, right? Of care for others, however understood, or religious commitment, whatever it might be. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm just speaking because others aren't here. But again, this is normal, right? And I think one of the things that you find in Buddhist teachings about no self, when you get more familiar with material, is that actually that isn't necessarily a giving up, right? It's rather that the self, as we understand it, never existed anyways. And it's the habit of attaching oneself to a lasting or attaching one's kind of mental processes to a lasting self that never existed that keeps us from living the lives that we want, right? In fact, our habits of protecting this thing that we think exists, feeding this thing that we exist. No one's saying starve yourself, but giving it new experiences, right? Identifying it, judging it. And we have a lot of problems in American culture, as you all know, with self-judgment. All of these processes limit one's capacity to just be available to the experiences that are constantly changing, including the experiences that themselves could lend themselves to opportunities for helping others. So in a way, like no self is understood in this way, and I know it's a big pill to swallow, is understood as actually opening up possibilities by loosening. Do you remember that metaphor of loosening the sticks? Right? It's a loosening. And in a way, this would be a challenge to you all, noticing, if you want to take this experiment to heart, noticing for a day how many ways we limit ourselves by choosing not to do something because it's not the kind of thing we do. Not to go somewhere because it's the kind of thing that we don't go. Not to say something because it's not the kind of thing we don't say. I think about this all the time when I see my parents, right? Which is that it's really hard to go home and just have any conversation with your family members. We're all kind of stuck in a certain rut. Even if you have loving relationships, you just wouldn't talk about certain things with certain friends or colleagues, right? And if you've ever had that kind of like a breakthrough conversation where you talk about something you wouldn't otherwise talk about, it's kind of liberating and strange. Like, what is this world I live in? I mean, we all remember the feeling of being a teenager, right? And you're whatever, you're romantically inclined or something and interested in a human being, and you tell them that, and it seems like a conversation that could never have, and now you live in a totally new world, right? But in any event, why do I talk about this? Because these are examples of the ways in which our really subtle, unnoticed attachment to self. This is who I am. This is how I do things. This is how I'm supposed to do things. Just limit. In a way, I think that might be an entry point to thinking about no self, right? And so the arguments about not finding the self have to do with the fact that any of the pieces that we do identify with, especially the really strong ones, these are the kinds of things I do. This is the kind of person I am. None of those last. They're all changing. They're here and gone. Even our beliefs, which I know probably sounds insulting to people here, but even our beliefs, if you think about it, are momentary enactments of thinking, and then they're gone. Now, they might continue to reemerge, right? They are habits, right? Our commitment to whatever we most believe in are kind of foundational habits that we return to that motivate us over and over again. But each of those moments of motivation is just here and gone. Same thing with your memories, which, as we all know, are constantly changing. Same thing with the kind of language you use to speak to yourself, right? Do this today, don't do this today. These pieces are always moving. And so that's, I think, what we mean by not finding a self. To answer the question in the chat, all of these pieces that we think build the life that we have are in fact impediments to skillfully engaging with the world insofar as they are looser than we think they are. That's the kind of pitch. I know this is a little bit difficult in a summative exercise to describe, but I would say like that's a metaphor you may want to explore. How are these habits of thinking about myself limiting, right? How by embracing the fact that even these aspects of my body and my mind are changing, right? By just loosening up a little bit, or there's more opportunity for engaging what's really around me. I'd suggest thinking about it in those terms. Yeah, transformed boundless selflessness, David. Thank you. That's really a beautiful way of thinking about it. Yeah. The only challenge there, and just to push back a little bit, is how dramatic the actual conclusion of no self is. Because sometimes people think, and maybe I've made this joke before, right, that a no self, an enlightened self is just like a super self. It's like me, but me without the suffering part. Me, but the me that's a little bit nicer, right? And really, that's, I think, a misunderstanding. Not that, David, that's your understanding at all. But I think the no self part is really quite radical, right? So the transformed boundless piece is a beautiful way of putting it, right? But being transformed and boundless means there's really nothing that's bound. I mean, like actually bound. This is the same metaphor we're coming back, which is hard to conceptualize. Yeah. Which, by the way, is why people tell stories, right? Because it's hard to conceptualize in the abstract sense beyond the stories of either real human beings you know or even someone like the Buddha. All right. I think this is plenty. Any other thoughts or questions just in the spirit of taking advantage of our time before we do a close in the chat? Well, I really appreciate you spending time with me. I hope some of these ideas have been sufficiently provocative to be a little bit valuable, and I hope that you return to some of this material, or please feel free to be in touch. I should say for the folks who are here live, Matthew, who's helped so much with this, with the kind of tech part, has been loading the videos to the YouTube location. And underneath the actual video, I provide a couple links to materials that we've referenced each week. I didn't give a lot. I don't want to overwhelm folks, but there are a couple links you could look there. And then always feel free to reach out to me. Maybe I'll put my work email, my Fordham email in one of those YouTube links. I can ask Matthew to do that so you can easily find me. And I'd love to be in touch. And I think that Kimberly is maybe going to take over here to close our session. So thank you again for spending so much time with me.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Shapiro. We are enlightened and we are, I think, overwhelmed a little bit by the five courses that you delivered. And I think that's why you're seeing some of our silence, is because it's a lot to ponder and it takes time. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful course. So thank you. And we really look forward to the next one. The next course actually starts in February. I'll give you the dates. It's February 26th. It's the end of February. It's the first course, and then there'll be 5 consecutive course runs then. So anyone who, I'm sure you've already registered, but if you haven't, feel free to register before February 26th so that you can jump on those courses as well. I also want to let you know that our next webinar is going to be on November 12th, and that one is the social impacts of relational AI. So we look forward to seeing everyone there as well. Again, thank you so much for this course. I know that we have over 100 people registered for this course, and we do know that many people watched it after the fact because we get some statistics on the viewings that we have on our YouTube page. So there's a lot of people out there watching and pondering and questioning. So thank you very much for that. And just on a closing note, I know Sister Maria is not able to be with us tonight. She's in Italy. Yesterday, her and Sister Attilia left for Sister Attilia's brother's funeral. So if you can all just, keep them in your thoughts and your prayers during this difficult time. It was a little bit sudden. So it was a difficult day for them yesterday, and they are there this evening. I've been in touch with them. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and we will see you at the next session.